Her name was Vera Kowalczyk. She was 54 years old. It was 1 a.m, and she was alone in a dark stamping plant with a mop in her hands. The foreman shouldered past her on his way to the door. He did not look at her. "Lights when you're done, sweetheart," he said. And then he was gone, out into the cold, his truck coughing to life in the lot. Vera kept mopping. She did not flinch. She had heard worse, from better men, and she had outlasted all of them. Now let me show you something. The next afternoon, 12 men sat around a table in that same plant, hunting for a saboteur. The owner's money was bleeding out through the night shift, and somebody had to bleed for it. The day foreman leaned back in his chair. Dale Merrick was his name. "Nobody who matters works those nights but us," he said. He said it right over the head of the woman emptying the ashtrays in front of him. Not one man at that table turned to look at her. And that same night, when the building was dark again, and hers again, Vera stopped at press number 4. She laid her palm flat against the cold steel. She laid it there, the way a doctor lays 2 fingers on a wrist. And she said a time out loud, soft, only to herself. 240, she murmured. "Why? Hold that. We'll get there. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you." Before we go on, if stories like this one are why you're here, do me a favor and subscribe, because I've got more of them coming. And leave a comment telling me the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Ridgway, Ohio, autumn of 1972. The kind of town where the leaves came down red over brick streets, and every man's paycheck had the same words stamped on it. Corcoran Tool and Stamping. It sat at the low end of Water Street, a long building of soot-darkened brick with high windows, and inside it the presses ran day and night, hammering flat steel into the shapes that other men bolted into other machines all over the country. Vera Kowalczyk cleaned that plant at night. She made $1.55 an hour to do it. She came in when the second shift was clocking out, and she left when the sky over the river was going gray. In between, the whole building belonged to her, in the way a thing can belong to the one person still awake to hear it. She had a routine. She'd learned long ago that a routine was a kind of prayer, if you did it right. First the offices, while the coffee smell still hung in them. Then the long walk down the main aisle with the wide dust mop, past the presses, standing quiet under their work lights, past the lathes with their chucks locked and their beds wiped down by men who wiped them down, because she'd trained the men who'd trained them, though not one soul in that building knew it anymore. She stopped, that first night I'm telling you about, at a wooden chair somebody had left shoved out crooked from a workbench. She pushed it back square. Small thing. She did it anyway. A chair out of place bothered her the way a wrong note bothers a person who used to play. Then she came to the nameplates. Corcoran had a habit going back to the old man's day. Every machine wore a little brass plate with a number on it, and the good machines. The ones that had earned it wore a second plate with a name. Not a man's name, the machine's name. The big double-crank press by the loading door was Bessie, worn almost smooth. The number 2 turret lathe was called the Deacon because the old-timers swore it only broke down on Sundays. Vera took a rag from her apron and wiped the brass on the Deacon until it caught the light. She wiped it slow. She wiped it the way you'd touch the shoulder of somebody you'd known a long time, somebody who was getting old the same as you. There was a radio up on a shelf near the tool crib, left on low by the second shift, and it was playing something soft with a lot of strings in it. She let it play. The music and the mop and the sleeping machines. That was the whole world at that hour, and it was enough. Here is the thing you have to understand about Vera, the thing the 12 men at that table would not have believed if you'd swore it on a Bible. She loved that plant. Not the job, the plant, the actual iron and brick of it. She had watched it go up. She had been inside it when it was new and loud and full of a promise nobody kept. She was here at the beginning, and no one under 50 knew it, and she had made her peace with the not knowing the way you make peace with a bad hip. You stop expecting it to be otherwise. She finished the aisle. She rolled her bucket into the washroom and dumped it and rinsed it, and on her way back out she passed press number 4, and she slowed down, because press number 4 had said something to her the night before that she didn't like. You work around machines long enough, they talk. Not in words. In sounds, in the little hitches and hums, in the way a thing lands when it's landing wrong. A press that's healthy has a rhythm to it, a heartbeat, and Vera had spent a lifetime learning to hear when a heartbeat skips. 2 nights running, number 4 had skipped. Right around the shift change. Right in that 20-minute dead gap, when one crew was clocking out and the next was still stumbling in with their coffee, when nobody's hand was on anything and nobody's eye was on the floor. Twice now, in that exact window, she'd heard the ram come down a hair late and grab. She stood there in front of it a moment. She didn't touch it that first night. She just looked at it, the big cold shape of it in the work light, and she filed the sound away where she filed everything, in that long, orderly place in her head that nobody had ever thought to ask about. Then she went home. Because that was the job. See everything. Say nothing. Come back and do it again. Now, the daylight side of this story. Harlan Corcoran was 43 years old, and he was drowning. He'd inherited the plant from his father the way you inherit a house with a bad roof, grateful and terrified in the same breath. For a while the numbers had held. Then, over the last few months, they'd started to slide, and the slide had a pattern to it that kept Harlan up at night. The failures came at night. Presses jamming, lathes seizing, whole batches coming out of the annealing furnace, soft and scrap and worthless. Always the night shift, always at the worst possible moment, when a big order was due. And there was a buyer circling. There's always a buyer circling a wounded thing. Halloran Industries, out of Cleveland, a company that bought up little plants the way a certain kind of man buys up the houses on a street where the mill just closed. They'd had a standing offer on Corcoran for a year now. $280,000. A lowball. An insult, the kind of number you offer a man you expect to be desperate soon. And now the bank was nervous, and the board, Harlan's board, was 3 old men and a widow who'd rather have the cash. The board had set a date. 9 days out. In 9 days they would vote. If the numbers turned, if Harlan could show them the bleeding had stopped, they'd hold. If not, they'd take Halloran's insult and be done with it. And every name on every paycheck in Ridgeway would have to find a new word to live under. 9 days. That was the clock ticking under everything, though most of the men on the floor didn't know how loud it was. So Harlan did what a cornered man does. He called a meeting, and he pointed at somebody, and he made it their problem. He pointed at Dale Merrick. Dale was the day foreman, 47. A big square man who'd come up off the floor and never let anybody forget he'd come up off the floor. He had a way of standing with his thumbs in his belt like he owned the concrete. Harlan stood him up in front of the whole first shift and said it plain. There was a saboteur in this plant. Somebody was cutting the throat of every man in this room, a little at a time, on the night shift, and Dale Merrick was going to find him. Dale had the run of the place. Dale had the authority. Whatever it took. Dale nodded, slow and grave, like a man accepting a weight, and if you'd been watching his eyes instead of his chin, you might have seen something move in them that had no business being there. Something almost like pleasure. Because here is what not one man in that plant knew, and what I'm going to let you carry the whole rest of this story like a stone in your shoe. The saboteur was Dale Merrick. It had been Dale from the first jammed press. Halloran Industries had gotten to him a year back, quiet, in a parking lot in Cleveland, and they'd made him a promise. Tank the plant. Make the failures look like an old building dying of old age. Make Corcoran so sick that 280,000 looked like mercy. And when Halloran took it over, Dale Merrick would not be a foreman anymore. Dale Merrick would be a plant manager, with a real office and a real chair and his name on a real door. So when Harlan Corcoran handed Dale Merrick the job of finding the saboteur, what he had actually done, God help him, was put the fox in charge of counting the hens, and Dale had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. That was the 8th day before the vote. Danny Prozac saw the whole meeting from the back. Danny was 19. He was the night shift apprentice, which mostly meant he swept chips and fetched stock and got yelled at, but he was learning. And he wanted to learn. And he had the one quality that made Vera's whole night worth working. He said hello to her. "Evening, Miss Vera," he'd say. Every night, the same, when their shifts crossed in that gray shift change gap. Just those 2 words. But you have no idea what 2 words are worth to a person who spent 15 years being furniture. She would have walked through fire for that boy and never told him so. It was Danny who noticed the brass. A few nights after the meeting, Vera was working her way down past the die storage racks, and she stopped at an idle press with a die set up in it that hadn't been run in a week. She reached into her apron. She always wore the same gray apron with the deep front pocket. And she drew out a small tool. Danny happened to be walking by with an armload of stock, and he caught the glint of it. It was a feeler gauge. Brass, a little fan of thin blades, each one a different thickness, for measuring the gap between 2 close things. A machinist's tool, not a cleaner's tool. Vera slid one blade into the gap between the die halves, gentle, feeling for something, her whole face gone still and listening the way it went when she was reading a thing. Danny stopped. "Where'd you get that, Miss Vera?" She didn't look up. She drew the blade out, folded it back into the fan, and dropped the little tool back into her apron pocket. "Long time ago," she said. And that was all. Danny stood there a second, waiting for more, the way a young man does. But there wasn't any more coming, and he had stock to move, so he moved it, and by the time he'd stacked it, he'd half forgotten. That's how these things go. The most important thing you'll see all year, and it goes by like a bird past a window, and you don't know for months that it was the whole story flying past. Long time ago. Remember that. Hold on to that brass gauge. You're going to see it 3 more times before we're through, and the last time it's going to break your heart in the best way. Now Dale ran his hunt, and I want you to see how he ran it, because how a man hunts tells you what he's really after. Dale ran it loud. Dale ran it lazy. He checked badges at the door like the failures might be walking in through the front with a name tag on. He ordered the night men's lockers searched, all of them, tossed like a police raid, and he stood over it with his thumbs in his belt while grown men watched their lunch pails and their spare gloves and their little private things get pawed through by a stranger. He questioned the powerless, the new hires, the old ones close to retirement who couldn't afford to make trouble, the men with the least standing and the most to lose. Never once did he look up the ladder. Never once did he look at himself. And he had a special little contempt he saved for Vera. Because Vera had started lingering, she couldn't help it. Number 4 was getting worse, and every night she'd find some reason to be near it, to stand in front of it and listen, to lay her palm on it. And Dale caught her at it one afternoon when he'd stayed late, standing there with her rag and her hand flat on the cold steel like she was taking its temperature. "Hey!" He came up behind her. "Floors, honey, not machines." He said honey like a man flicking ash. "You want to touch something? Touch the mop. That press is above your pay grade by about $3 an hour." And he laughed at his own joke, the way that kind of man always laughs at his own joke, alone, and walked off satisfied. Vera didn't answer. She wiped the machine one more slow pass and moved on. But her jaw had set, just a little, the way a thing sets before it holds. Floors, honey, not machines. Keep that line. It's going to cost him everything. Later, when the same faces that heard it hear the truth. But that's later. Right now, Dale Merrick is the biggest man in the building, and Vera Kowalczyk is the smallest. And everybody in Ridgeway would have bet the plant on it staying that way. Now here's where it turned. Here's the day the whole thing tipped over from bad to unforgivable, and you'll want to remember it. Because it's the moment Vera stopped just watching. Dale called an all hands. Both shifts overlapping, the floor packed, men standing on the aisle stripes with their arms crossed. Harlan up on the little raised dock by the loading door, looking gray. And Dale in front of everybody, thumbs in his belt, playing sheriff. He'd found his man, he said. He'd been through the maintenance logs and the time cards, and the pattern pointed one direction, and he wasn't going to stand up here and pretend, because these men deserved the truth. The saboteur, Dale said, was Walt. Walt, old nightman Walt, 66 years old, 31 years on that floor. A man so slow and so gentle he took 20 minutes to eat a sandwich, because he chewed every bite like it owed him money. Walt, who ran the auxiliary press on nights, and who had never in his life done a fast thing or a mean one. Dale laid it out. There'd been a failure on the number 2 lathe 3 nights back, grit in the oil line, seized the whole thing, and the log showed Walt had been the last man near that end of the floor before it went. That was it. That was the whole case. Proximity and a hunch. And Vera, standing off at the edge of the crowd with her bucket, felt something cold go through her. Because Vera knew. She knew for a fact that Walt could not have done it. She'd been 40 feet from Walt that whole shift, cleaning the wash-up station, and she'd watched him eat that sandwich, and she'd watched him sit and rest his bad knee, and she knew to the minute where he'd been. And he had never once gone near the number 2 lathe. She knew something else, too. Something she couldn't have put into words yet, but could feel in her hands. She knew the grit in that oil line hadn't gotten there by accident. But that was the part she didn't have proof of. The part she did have proof of was Walt. Walt was innocent, and she was the only living witness, and the witness was a woman with a mop. She stepped forward. She actually did it. 15 years of see everything, say nothing, and she broke it. Because a man was about to lose 31 years over a lie, and she was the only one who could say so. She stepped up out of the crowd, and she opened her mouth, and she got as far as he wasn't, and Dale cut her off like snapping a stick. Go finish the bathrooms. Flat, bored, not even angry. He didn't even turn all the way around to say it. He said it the way you'd wave off a fly, and a couple of the younger men actually laughed. A nervous little laugh, and the whole crowd sort of shifted its weight away from her, embarrassed for her, wanting her gone so the important business could go on. And Harlan Corcoran, up on the dock, gray and drowning and looking at his shoes. Harlan let it happen. He could have said, "Let her speak." He was the owner. One word from him. He didn't say it. He was too busy looking at his own 9-day clock to hear the one true thing being said in his whole plant. That's the part that should haunt a man. Not the villain. The villain does what villains do. It's the good tired man who lets it happen because he's got bigger problems. That's the everyday kind of wrong that keeps the world the way it is. So Vera stood there, with her mouth still half open and nothing coming out, and Walt, old Walt, understood what was happening before she did. He took off his gloves. He set them on his bench, neat, side by side, the way he did everything. He got his coat and his lunch pail. And he walked. Down the main aisle, the whole plant watching, past Bessie and past the deacon with its brass all shined, past press number 4, and out the door into the afternoon, 31 years walking out on a hunch, and the door swung shut behind him with that heavy factory sound. and that was that. And I want you to see Vera in that moment, because the camera of your mind should hold on her. Her jaw was set hard now, all the way set. Her eyes were dry and very steady. And down at her side, in the deep pocket of that gray apron, her hand had closed around the little brass feeler gauge, closed tight. Her thumb running over the thin fan of blades the way another person might run a thumb over a rosary. Something had finished happening inside her. You couldn't see it from the outside. But it was done. Because here is what Dale Merrick had done, in his arrogance, that he would never in 1,000 years have understood. He had taken a woman who only wanted to stay useful and unseen, a woman who'd spent 15 years making herself smaller and smaller until she was almost gone, and in front of the whole plant he had told her to go finish the bathrooms. And in doing it, he had woken up the one person in that building who actually knew what was killing it. She would not accuse him. That wasn't her way. And it wouldn't have worked besides. Who'd believe her? But she was going to know. She was going to know all of it. Every bit. The how and the when and the exactly who. And she was going to hold it in her steady hands until the day it could not be waved off like a fly. And number 4 had already told her where to start. That night the plant was hers again. And it was different. The love was still there. But now there was a job under the love. A real one. The kind of job she hadn't done in almost 30 years, and God help her if some part of her hadn't missed it. She started with number 4, because number 4 was the one she was surest of. She waited. She cleaned the aisle slow, keeping an ear open, and she watched the clock, and she was there, standing right there. When the shift change gap came, that 20-minute dead zone, and she heard it. The ram came down a hair late and grabbed. That same little skip in the heartbeat, right on schedule. And now she let herself think the thought she'd been circling for a week. That wasn't wear. You have to understand how a machine wears, to understand why this mattered. Wear is slow, and it's honest. A part gets old, it drifts, it fails a little more each day, and it fails whenever it feels like it. A worn thing has no schedule. But number 4 wasn't drifting. Number 4 was fine all day, and fine all evening, and then, in one specific 20-minute window when no eye was on the floor, it failed, clean, and then it was fine again. Twice, 3 times now. Wear doesn't watch the clock. Only a man watches the clock. So she got closer. She got her palm on the machine during a still moment, and she felt the die, felt the gap where the two halves came together, and she got out the brass gauge and she measured it. And there it was. The gap was wrong. Not worn wrong, set wrong. Somebody had put a shim in, a thin sliver of shim stock, tucked where you'd never look. Sized just right so the press ran fine under a light load and grabbed under a heavy one, and grabbed worst right when the ram was cold in that shift change gap. A worn gap is ragged. This gap was even. This gap had been decided. She sat back on her heels in the work light with the brass gauge in her hand, and she felt the whole shape of it come clear, the way a photograph comes clear in the tray. These weren't breakdowns. Every one of them was a decision. Somebody was reaching into these machines and setting them to fail, sizing each little sabotage so it read as fatigue, as an old building dying, and dropping each one into the 20-minute window when the floor was blind. It was patient. It was smart. It was deniable. Any one of these failures, by itself, looked like bad luck. It was only when you laid them side by side, the way only a person who was there every single night could lay them side by side, that you saw the hand behind them. And she thought about what it would take to do this. You'd need to get into the die room, where the shim stock and the setup tools were. That meant a key. And you'd need to know the maintenance schedule cold, know which machine was due for a heavy run and when, know the shift change gap to the minute. That meant the log. A key to the die room and access to the maintenance log. That was a short list. That was a very short list, in a plant this size, and Vera stood there in the dark and she started, quietly, to count the names on it. She didn't say any of them out loud. Not yet. But she'd stopped being a woman who wondered. She was a woman who was going to be sure. Here's the micro-test she gave herself. That same week, the thing that told her she still had it. She'd worked out that the number 2 lathe, the Deacon, was drifting toward a heavy run on Thursday, and she'd found the beginnings of grit in one of its oil lines. Just a trace, just a seeding of it. And she reasoned that if she was right about all of this, the Deacon would seize during Thursday's second heavy cycle. In the gap, and not before. She didn't warn anybody. What good would it have done? Go finish the bathrooms. She just watched. And on Thursday night, in the gap, on the second heavy cycle, the Deacon ground itself to a stop with a sound like a spoon in a garbage disposal, exactly when she'd said it would. To herself, alone, she stood in the aisle with her mop, and she didn't feel triumphant. She felt old, and sure, and a little bit sick, because being right about this meant somebody in her plant was doing it on purpose. But under the sick feeling was something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something she was almost ashamed of. She felt like herself again. The next morning, Dale Merrick stood over the dead lathe with his thumbs in his belt and told the day crew it was just the plant falling apart, just old iron giving out. One more reason the smart money said sell before it all went to scrap. And the men nodded, tired, believing him. Because he was the foreman, and they were tired, and it was easier to believe the building was just dying than to believe one of their own was killing it. And 40 feet away, a woman ran a dust mop down the aisle and did not look up. But her hand, in her apron pocket, closed once around a little fan of brass. She knew the gap in that lathe would measure set, not worn. She knew if she looked, she'd find grit that no clean oil line puts there by itself. She knew. Now, almost all of it. Almost, there was still the matter of catching the hand in the act, of proving it to men who'd sooner tell her to finish the bathrooms. There was still the matter of the shim she'd have to preserve, and the die she'd have to mark, and the night. She could feel it coming. The night when whoever this was would reach too far and try to burn somebody for it. She had a bad feeling she knew who they'd try to burn. There was only one innocent left on that floor, young enough and small enough to make an easy fire. She thought about Danny saying evening, Miss Vera, and something in her chest went hard and protective and certain. She measured the lathe's gap the next night, just to be sure. Set, not worn. She was right. She was right about everything now. The only question left was how many days she had before the man with the dye room key reached for the boy. She had 4 days. She counted them the way she counted everything now, quietly, while her hands did other work. The board would meet on Thursday. 9 days had become 4. And in 4 days, the man with the dye room key would need his biggest failure yet, the one that would make the numbers on Harlan Corcoran's desk look like a body already cold. She knew how these things worked. A slow bleed doesn't sell a plant. A slow bleed just makes men tired. What sells a plant is a night when the whole floor stops at once and somebody young and easy takes the blame. Then the board looks at each other and says the word out loud. Sell, and they go home feeling wise. So she waited. And she cleaned. It happened on a Tuesday, the thing that told her the clock had run out. She was mopping the far aisle when she heard it. Press number 4, running rough on the second shift, a hitch in its stroke like a man limping on a bad knee. The day crew had gone. The night crew wasn't full yet. And in that gap, that 20-minute seam in the day where nobody's really watching the floor, she heard the press start to eat itself. She didn't run. Vera Kowalczyk had not run in 30 years. But she moved. She set the mop against the wall, and she crossed that floor faster than a 54-year-old woman has any right to, and she got to the press before it took a hand or lost a die. There was a boy on it. Not Danny, a second-shift kid named Reuben, 17 maybe, sweating, his hand already reaching in toward the jam because that's what tired boys do, they reach in. "Don't," she said. Just that. And something in the flat of her voice stopped him cold. He looked at her, the cleaning woman, and for 1 second she watched him decide whether to listen to furniture. "It's fed a bad blank," she said. "The ram's off its bottom. You put your hand in there, and it comes down, it doesn't care whose it is. Step back." He stepped back. She looked at the die. She didn't need the gauge to see it this time. She'd been living with these machines for months, listening, and the press was telling her everything. The gap was wrong. Not worn wrong. Set wrong. Somebody had been in there, and here was the thing that made her chest go cold. If that press seized tonight, on second shift, with the day foreman gone and the log showing who signed off on it last, the name on that failure would be the last man to touch the die. She knew the log. She'd read it while she emptied the office baskets. The last name, on press number 4, was a night shift apprentice. The last name was Danny Prozac. So she did the thing she would never tell anyone she did. She sent the boy Reuben to the far end of the floor for a broom he didn't need. And while he was gone, in that empty 20 minutes that belonged to no shift, Vera Kowalczyk fixed the machine. She found the shim first. It was still there, right where her gauge had told her it would be weeks ago. A wafer of steel no thicker than a fingernail, sitting in the die gap where it had no business being. A shim like that doesn't wander in. A shim like that is placed. She worked it loose with 2 fingers, and she held it in the light, and she looked at it the way you look at a bullet somebody left in a wall. Then she did something a janitor would never think to do. She marked the die, a small scribe line, low on the block, in a spot only someone who knew to look would ever find. She wanted to be able to say, later, in front of men, "This is the same die, this is the same block, nobody switched it on me." And she wrapped the shim in a square of rag and put it in the deep pocket of her apron, next to the brass. Then she reset the gap. Her hands knew it. That was the part that would have stopped anyone watching, if anyone had been watching. The way her hands moved. Not fumbling, not guessing. She backed the ram, she cleared the bad blank, she seated the halves true, and she brought the whole thing back into tolerance by feel, the brass gauge sliding in and out, until the drag was exactly right. Exactly, not close. Right, when Reuben came back with his broom she was standing there with the mop again, an old woman leaning on a stick, and the press ran clean. "You do something?" he asked. "Wiped it down," she said. It was greasy. "You be careful reaching into things, son." He never knew. Nobody knew. The morning crew came in, and press number 4 ran like a watch, and Dale Merrick walked past it with his thumbs in his belt, and never understood that the failure he'd planted had already been undone by the woman he told to go finish the bathrooms. And Danny Prozac kept his job that day, and never learned how close he'd come to losing it. That was the night she stopped waiting, because she understood now what she was up against. Dale wasn't going to stop. Every trap she quietly sprung, he'd just set another. She could keep saving Danny in the dark, one press at a time, for the rest of her life, and it would never be enough. Because Dale had the clock on his side, and she didn't. He only had to succeed once. She had to succeed every single night. That's no way to win. She knew that from the war. You don't win by patching, you win by catching the hand. So she started to listen harder, not to the machines now, to the men. The office was hers, at night. She emptied the baskets, she ran the carpet sweeper, she wiped Harlan Corcoran's desk where he left rings from his coffee cup. Men forget that the person cleaning up after them can hear. Men have always forgotten that. It's the oldest fact in the world, and they never learn it. She was in the hall, outside the office, Wednesday night, 1 in the morning, running a rag along the baseboard, when she heard Dale Merrick's voice through the door. He wasn't supposed to be there. Day foreman, go home. But there he was. And there was the telephone. And there was that low, careful voice men use when they're saying something they'd hang for. Thursday, Dale said. The tour's Thursday night. Corcoran's parading the whole board through the floor to show them the place still runs. That's when. A pause. The other voice, tinny, far away. Halloran, press 4, Dale said. 2:40 in the morning. Right in the shift gap. Right when they're standing there watching. It'll stop the whole line. And I've got the log fixed so it lands on the Prozac kid. Green apprentice, signed off on the die last. Nobody'll blink. Board sees the plant die in front of their own eyes. They vote to sell Thursday sun up. You get your building. I get my chair. Vera stood very still in the hall with a rag in her hand. 2:40. The same time she'd murmured to herself weeks ago, palm flat on the cold steel, when Danny asked her what she was doing, and she didn't answer. 2:40. She'd known the rhythm of that machine so well she'd felt the failure coming before the man who was planting it had even scheduled it. She hadn't been guessing. She'd been reading a clock only she could hear. Now she had the whole thing. The when, the what, the who, the why. She had it all. And she had nothing. Because who would believe the cleaning woman? She went home that morning as the sky was going gray over Ridgeway, and she sat at her own kitchen table with her coat still on, and she thought about it for a long time. She thought about Walt walking out the gate with his box, an innocent man, 66 years old. 31 years at the plant, gone on a foreman's word. She thought about Danny saying evening, Miss Vera. She thought about a dye room in 1943, full of women's hands and men who came home from the war and took those hands' jobs and never once said thank you. And she thought, all right. Thursday, then, they'd never listen to her. Fine, she wouldn't ask them to listen. She'd make the machine talk for her at 2:40 in the morning in front of every man who'd ever looked straight through her. She'd let the plant say it, in the only language those men had ever really respected. Thursday night came in cold and clear. The board came at 11. 6 men in good coats, and Harlan Corcoran leading them, talking too fast. The way a man talks when he's drowning and doesn't want anyone to see the water. Gray in his face. 43 years old and looking 60. He walked them down the aisles, and he pointed at the presses, and he told them about orders, about the new steel contract, about how the failures were nothing, just old iron, and every man on that board had already made up his mind and was just waiting to be polite about it. Dale Merrick walked with them. Foreman, right at Harlan's shoulder, nodding. Helpful, the very picture of a man who'd been put in charge of finding the saboteur. He'd been put in charge of finding himself, and he wore it like a good suit. Vera cleaned. She stayed near. Not close enough to be told to leave, close enough to hear. She ran her dust mop down the aisle by press number 4, back and forth, patient, invisible, the way she'd been invisible her whole life on that floor. And she watched the clock on the wall by the tool crib, and she waited for 2:40. 1 in the morning. The board was tired and cold and wanted to go home. She could see it. Harlan could see it too, and the panic was coming off him now like heat. 2 o'clock. And then it happened, the thing she hadn't planned, the thing that changed everything. Harlan Corcoran, drowning, out of talk, out of numbers, turned around in the middle of that floor and looked for something, anything, and his eye landed on the woman with the mop. Maybe it was despair. Maybe it was the founder's son in him remembering, somewhere far back, that his father used to talk to the floor and not just the front office. But he looked at her, really looked, for the first time in the years she'd worked for him, and he said, in front of the whole board, half a laugh in it, Half a drowning man's prayer, you. You're here every night. You hear everything in this place. A pause. What do you think's wrong with my plant? The board turned. 6 men in good coats, turning to look at a 54-year-old woman in a shop apron holding a mop. Dale Merrick turned too. And she watched his face, and she saw the exact moment his easy smile went stiff at the corners. Because Dale Merrick had spent his whole life assuming she was furniture, and it had just occurred to him, 1 second too late, that furniture doesn't have eyes. Vera set the mop against the press. She could have been small. She'd been small her whole life. It was safe there. But she thought about Walt, and she thought about the dye room in 43, and she thought about the boy who said evening. Miss Vera, and she stood up straight for the first time in front of these men, and her voice came out level and flat and clear. You pay me to sweep up after the machines, Mr. Corcoran, she said. I've been listening to them since before your father hired the men who run them. Nobody laughed now. Your plant isn't dying, she said. Your plant is being killed. On purpose. By a hand, and the hand's going to reach again tonight, in about 40 minutes. Because you've got your whole board standing here, and there'll never be a better time to make you all believe the place is finished. Dale made a sound. A little scoff, meant to be easy, and it came out too high. Harlan, come on. She mops the floors, press 4, Vera said. Right over him, not loud, just certain. We'll jam at 2:40. 20 minutes from now, give or take. Right in the shift gap, when the day men are gone and the night men aren't set yet. It'll stop this whole line dead. She looked at Dale then, straight at him, and she said the last part slow. Watch who's standing near it when it does. The board looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the woman, and Harlan Corcoran, a drowning man, did the only thing a drowning man can do with a hand that comes out of the dark. He grabbed it. We'll wait, he said. So they waited. It was the longest 40 minutes of Dale Merrick's life, and Vera watched every second of it cross his face. He tried to talk them out of it. He said it was foolish, said the woman was simple, said they'd all catch cold standing on a factory floor in the middle of the night listening to a janitor's ghost stories. But the more he talked, the worse it looked, because there's a thing that happens to a guilty man asked to wait for a clock, and every man on that board could feel it happening to Dale, even if they couldn't have named it. Vera didn't say another word. She'd said her piece. Now she let the plant take over. She stood by press number 4 with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she watched the clock, and the presses ran, and the radio somebody'd left on the shelf by the tool crib played something low and old, and the minutes went by like water dropping off a roof. 2:30. 2:35. The board had stopped talking. Even the tired ones were watching the clock now. Something about a woman standing that still, that sure, in front of a machine, it gets into men. Harlan had his hand at his mouth. Dale had drifted, without seeming to mean to, toward the far end of the line, away from press number 4. And Vera saw that too, and she almost smiled. Because a man who plants a bomb doesn't want to be standing on it when it goes. 2:38. The day men clocked out. The gap opened. That 20-minute seam in the night where the floor belongs to no one. 2:39. And press number 4 ran its stroke, and ran it again, and on the third stroke it hitched. Vera heard it before the machine did. She heard the little catch, the wrong sound, the limp in the knee. And then, at 2:40 in the morning, exactly, the way she'd said it, the way she'd known it for weeks, press number 4 seized with a sound like a dropped anvil, and the whole line went silent, dead silent, and 6 men in good coats jumped like they'd been shot. The radio kept playing. Everything else stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. And then Dale Merrick did the thing he'd rehearsed in his head 100 times. The thing that was supposed to save him, and it was the thing that hanged him. Because he did it in front of a woman who'd already told them all to watch. He came running up the aisle, loud, pointing, playing the foreman, and he shouted, "There it is. There's your saboteur." "The Prozac kid signed off on this die tonight. It's the apprentice. I've been saying it for weeks. He wasn't near it," Vera said. Dale stopped. "Danny Prozac's been on the annealing furnace since 11 o'clock, she said. 40 feet away, in front of 6 witnesses and you. He hasn't touched this press all night." She turned to Harlan. "But somebody touched it before tonight, Mr. Corcoran. And I can show you exactly what they did. Right now. If you'll let me." And Harlan Corcoran, standing over his dead machine with his whole board watching and his whole life on the table, said, "Show me." She crouched at the die. She was 54 years old, and her knees weren't what they were, and she went down slow, and every man on that floor watched a cleaning woman kneel at the guts of a stamping press like it was an altar. "A jam like this," she said, and her voice went into a rhythm now, an old rhythm. The rhythm of a woman who has explained machines to men before, long ago, reads like fatigue. Like old iron giving out. That's the whole trick. You make it look tired so nobody looks close. She reached into the die gap. But tired steel wears even. It wears all over. It doesn't grow a step in one place overnight. She brought out the brass feeler gauge. Danny Prozac, standing over by the cold furnace, made a small sound. He recognized it. The little fan of brass. "Where'd you get that, Miss Vera?" "Long time ago." She slid a leaf of it into the gap, and out, and chose another, and slid that one in. Her hands didn't fumble. That was the thing. That was the thing that started to turn the faces above her from doubt into something else. The hands didn't fumble. "This gap should run 4 thousandths, she said. "Feel of it, it's running 9. That's not wear. Wear closes a gap. It doesn't open one." She looked up. Somebody opened it. Somebody put a shim in these die halves to throw the whole stroke off, size just small enough that the press would run for a while and then eat itself at the worst possible time. And they did it in the shift gap, when the floor belongs to nobody, because that's the only window where nobody's watching the die. "That's insane," Dale said. "You can't prove I pulled the shim out 2 nights ago," Vera said. The floor went quiet again. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron, past the brass, and she took out the square of rag, and she unwrapped it, and there in the light on her flat open palm sat a wafer of steel no thicker than a fingernail. "I marked the die when I found it," she said. "Low on the block. There's a scribe line. Look for yourself, Mr. Corcoran. Nobody switched dies on you. It's the same block, and this came out of it." She held the shim up so it caught the light. "Machines don't grow these. Hands put them in. And only 2 things let a hand do it in that window without getting seen." She stood, slow, knees complaining, and she faced them all. A key to the die room. And access to the maintenance log to fix the paper so it lands on somebody green. She let that sit. "You've got a lot of men in this plant, Mr. Corcoran. How many of them carry both?" And every head on that floor, slowly, the way a field of wheat turns in a wind, turned toward Dale Merrick. He was already backing up. "Now wait," he said. "Wait, she's a janitor. She's got a piece of scrap steel in a rag. That doesn't mean." He was looking around now, the way a cornered thing looks around. "You're going to take the word of a woman who mops toilets over your own foreman?" "I've given this plant 15 years, then you won't mind the search," Harlan said. It was quiet when Harlan said it, but it stopped Dale like a hand on the chest. "You've been running searches for weeks, Dale," Harlan said. "Lockers, badges, your idea. Every man in this plant's had his locker turned out on your say-so." His voice was going hard now, and under the gray fear in his face something older was coming up, his father's face, maybe. "Every man but you. So let's do yours." Right now. In front of the board. You don't have the right. I own the building, Harlan said. I've got the right to everything in it. Gus, and he turned, and Vera realized for the first time that there was an old man sitting in a chair by the office wall, wrapped in a coat, brought along for the tour the way you bring a photograph. Gus, you kept the locker keys? Always did, said the old man, and his voice was a dry leaf, but it carried. They walked Dale to his locker with the whole board behind them, and Vera came too, because nobody thought to stop her now. Nobody would ever tell her to go finish the bathrooms again. She knew that already. She'd known it the moment the press stopped at 2:40. The locker opened. It was in a coffee can, under a pair of work gloves, folded small. A ledger, not the plants. A cheap drugstore notebook, and in it, in Dale Merrick's own careful hand, was every payment. Dates, amounts, and at the top of the first page, underlined twice, a name a lot of men on that board went white to see. Halloran Industries. Harlan read it aloud. He didn't shout. That was the worst of it, for Dale. Harlan Corcoran stood on his own factory floor and read out, in a flat, quiet voice, the price of his plant. A payment a year back, in a Cleveland parking lot, to start. Payments after, each one dated to a failure. And a last line, the promise, the thing Dale had sold everything for. Plant manager, Halloran Industries, upon completion of sale. That was your chair, Harlan said, and he looked up from the notebook. That's what I was worth to you, a parking lot handshake and somebody else's chair. Dale Merrick didn't say anything worth keeping. Men in his spot never do. He said it wasn't what it looked like, and then he said the plant was finished anyway, and then he said something ugly about all of them, and then he stopped talking, because there wasn't anything left to say. They walked him out to the gate to wait for the sheriff. 47 years old, 15 years at the plant, and this time it was the right man walking out with a box, and Vera Kowalczyk watched him go the way she'd watched Walt go. Except this time her jaw wasn't set. This time she just felt tired, and a little sad, the way you feel when a thing you knew was rotten finally falls. The board did not vote to sell. You can't sell a dying plant. But Corcoran Tool and Stamping wasn't dying. It had been murdered, slow, on purpose, by a man taking money to hold the pillow, and now the man was at the gate in cuffs and the plant was just a plant again. Old iron and cutting oil and a radio playing low, running clean the minute the shim came out. Halloran's offer had been built on one word. Unstoppable. The failures were supposed to be unstoppable. They'd been stopped by a woman with a mop and a piece of brass, and an offer built on a lie has nowhere to stand when the lie falls down. The board went home at dawn without saying the word sell, and it was never said again. But before they went, there was the last thing. The thing Vera hadn't seen coming. The thing that undid her when nothing else had. Harlan Corcoran stood on his floor in the gray light, with the notebook still in his hand, and he looked at the cleaning woman, and he could not make it fit. "I have to ask you," he said, and there was wonder in it, and something almost like shame. "How does a woman who cleans this plant at night know a die block by feel? Know a tolerance to the thousandth? Read a machine like a doctor reads a wrist?" He shook his head. "Who taught you that?" And it was old Gus who answered. The old man had gotten up out of his chair, 79 years old, moving on a cane, and he came across that floor slow, and he wasn't looking at his son. He was looking at the brass feeler gauge still in Vera's hand. He came right up to her, close, and he took her wrist, gentle, the way you touch something you thought was gone, and he turned the gauge in the gray light, and he read the little stamp on the steel that no one else had ever thought to read. "Warlot," he said softly. 1943. Government tool steel. He looked up at her face, and his old eyes were wet. "I know this gauge. I handed these out myself." A long breath. Kowalczyk. Vera. My God. I hired you. I hired you before the men came home. Hello, Gus, Vera said quietly. The old man turned to his son, to the whole board, and his dry leaf of a voice got, for a moment, strong. When the boys all went to the war, he said, we couldn't run this place. No men. So we hired the women. And this one, he lifted her hand a little, the one holding the gauge, this one had hands like nobody I ever saw. We put her in the tool and die room in 43. And by 44 she wasn't just running it. She was teaching it. He looked around at the presses, the lathes, the floor. Half the foremen who've run this floor for 30 years, she trained. She trained them. Taught them the die room. Taught them the tolerances. Taught them this machine you're all standing around. His voice cracked. And in 45, the boys came home and we needed the jobs for the boys, and we let the women go. Every one of them, including the best hand I ever hired. He was quiet a moment, hired her back years later. To mop. God forgive me, we hired Vera Kowalczyk back to mop the floors she taught men to work. Nobody said anything. On the whole floor, nobody said one word. The men who ran that plant were learning, all at once, in the gray of the morning, whose hands had taught the trade they'd built their lives on. They were looking at the furniture and seeing, too late by 30 years, that it had been the foundation the whole time. Danny Prozac was crying, and not ashamed of it, over by the cold furnace. 19 years old. The only one who'd ever said her name. Harlan Corcoran looked at the woman who'd saved his plant, his father's plant, and he could not find the size of it. He tried twice to speak and couldn't. And when he finally could, he didn't offer her money, and he didn't offer her thanks, because he understood dimly that those were too small. There's an office off the die room, he said. Maintenance master. It's been empty 2 years because nobody good enough would take it. He swallowed. It's yours, if you'll have it. I'll put your name on the door tomorrow. He looked around at the presses. Run the floor, Vera, run the floor you built. I'm asking you in front of every man here, the same men who, he stopped. He couldn't finish it. Everyone knew how it finished. The same men who told you to go finish the bathrooms. Vera Kowalczyk stood there in her shop apron, with a mop against the press and a piece of brass in her hand, and 30 years of being invisible coming apart all at once. And she did not cry, because she'd used up her crying a long time ago, in 1945, at a gate, with a box. She looked at the machine. Then she looked at the boy by the furnace. I'll take it, she said, on one condition. She nodded at Danny. The boy's my apprentice. He's the only one in this whole plant who ever looked at me and saw a person. She almost smiled. Turns out, that's a good eye for the trade. I can work with an eye like that. And that was how it ended, and how it began. Spring came to Ridgeway. 6 months later, the high windows of Corcoran Tool and Stamping ran with clean light, morning light, and the presses ran under it clean and true, one long, steady heartbeat of iron the way a good plant is supposed to sound. The smell of cutting oil, a radio playing low. All the old things, but running right now, because the hand that was killing it was 3 towns over, and the hand that saved it had its name on a door. The door said, V. Kowalczyk, maintenance master, in gold paint, and the men who'd worked that floor for 30 years had gotten used to knocking on it, and had gotten used to something stranger than that. They'd gotten used to the fact that when Vera said a gap was running wrong, it was running wrong, and they'd stopped arguing. Because you only argue with a thing like that a few times before you learn. The brass feeler gauge didn't live in her apron anymore. There was no apron. It hung on a hook by the number 4 line, out in the open, where any man on the floor could reach it, and they did, and when a young one asked what the stamp on it meant, an older one would tell him, quiet, and the young one would hold it a little differently after that. Danny Prozac was her apprentice, and he was good and getting better. She'd catch him at a die with a gauge in his hand and his lips moving, and she'd stop in the doorway and listen and hear him saying the tolerances back to himself the way she'd said them once, in a die room full of women, when the world was on fire and nobody thought to write down whose hands were holding it together. 4 thousandths, Danny would murmur. Not 5. 4. Not 5, she'd say from the door, and he'd grin without turning around. They asked her once, the men, over lunch, what became of Dale Merrick. She wasn't one for gossip, and she didn't dress it up. She just said what she'd heard. Gone to nothing 3 towns over, she said. And that was all she said about the man who'd told her to go finish the bathrooms. And Halloran Industries? Somebody asked that too, one time. The offer, Vera said, and she reached up and settled the brass gauge straight on its hook, was never mentioned again. She went back to the floor. That's the whole of it. A plant in Ohio, a long time ago. A woman who knew a place so well that she disappeared inside it. That's what happens, sometimes, to the ones who love a thing quietly and ask for nothing. They become part of the walls. They become furniture. They become the person you tell to get the lights on your way out, sweetheart, and never once turn to look at. And then comes a night, there's always a night, when the whole thing is falling and every man with a title has run out of answers, and it turns out the only one who can save it is the one nobody ever thought to ask, the one who was there at the beginning, the one who'd been listening the whole time. Some people know a place so well they become invisible in it, right up until the day it can only be saved by the one nobody thought to ask. If you're watching this, and you've ever been the quiet one who knew more than anybody guessed, the one they looked straight through, then you already understand Vera Kowalczyk better than any man on that floor ever did. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels.